following Suella Braverman's comments about the Metropolitan Police. The Home Secretary's been accused of making incorrect and inflammatory comments about the Metropolitan Police by Sadiq Khan. Braverman wrote an article in The Times which was not signed off by Downing Street in advance. Well, let's take a look at the comments that have caused this latest controversy. Braverman said there is a perception that senior police officers play favourites when it comes to protesters. Right-wing and nationalist protesters who engage in aggression are rightly met with a stern response, yet pro-Palestinian mobs displaying almost identical behaviour are largely ignored, even when clearly breaking the law. I've spoken to serving and former police officers who have noted this double standard. Well, Sir Keir Starmer says Braverman is divisive and is undermining the police.
Across the country, I think we see people who are reasonable, who are moderate, and who would always want to support the police in making difficult decisions in difficult circumstances. What you've got at the moment is the complete opposite. A Home Secretary who is divisive, who is stoking up tension at the very time that we should be trying to reduce tension, and is undermining the police as they go into a very difficult set of operational decisions. Then that's compounded by the fact that we've got a Prime Minister who is too weak to do anything about it. That's the worst of all circumstances. He must know that this isn't the way in which a Home Secretary should behave. He must know in himself that the role of responsible government is to reduce tension and to support the police in difficult decisions that they have to make. He's got a Home Secretary who's out of control, and he is too weak to do anything about it. That's the worst of all combinations.
And in addition to that, London Mayor Sadiq Khan says he was astonished by the Home Secretary's comments.
Behaviour over the last few weeks has been behaviour that is irresponsible. Her article in The Times was incorrect and inflammatory at a time when senior politicians should be bringing communities together, uniting people who have differences. Instead, she is stoking divisions. And I worry, as a consequence of her words and her behaviour, you'll see this Saturday on Armistice Day, the far right, EDL and other like people turning up on Saturday causing problems.
Okay, I'm joined in studio now by Tom Harwood. Tom, a dramatic day. It seems that the knives are out. You'd expect Starmer, you'd expect Sadiq Khan, you'd expect Yvette Cooper to be queuing up to have a go. But what's the mood within the Conservative ranks? Are the knives out for Suella? Do you think you should survive this?
It's really hanging in the balance, and I know that might sound sensationalist, but there's a really rather important piece of evidence that has popped up into the puzzle in the last hour when Pat McFadden, who of course is the Labour Party National Campaign Coordinator, well, he has written a letter, sent it to the Prime Minister, setting out the ministerial code. And what the ministerial code says about ministers freelancing, talking about policy, making major media interventions without getting sign-off from the number 10 press office. And Pat McFadden points to Article 8.2 of the Ministerial Code, which says that all such interventions have to be cleared by the number 10 press office. Now, if we're going to take what number 10 said at their word this morning in the lobby briefing at 11:30, when the Prime Minister's official spokesman said that there were parts of that article that the Home Secretary wrote for The Times that number 10 said that she must take out, and that she didn't take out. If we're to believe the account from number 10, and we haven't heard anyone say anything against that account, perhaps Suella Braverman in the fullness of time will say that number 10's wrong and she's right, or all the rest of it. But if we're to believe that account from number 10, then it would appear that Suella Braverman has breached the ministerial code, which in all normal times would be a resigning offence.
Is it that serious, though? This sounds like a procedural piece of minutiae. Is that in itself a sacking offence? Starmer is saying it will be weak to not sack his Home Secretary. But then why would you do what Keir Starmer says? Surely you should stand by your woman and dig in. And actually, Tom, a lot of Conservative voters out there are saying that Suella Braverman is one of the very few the real Conservatives left.
And the deep irony here is that 17 members of Keir Starmer's shadow ministerial team have directly defied him on the issue of a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, that would suggest that if the Labour Party were to hold themselves to the same standard as Article 8 of the Ministerial Code, Keir Starmer should be sacking 17 of his shadow ministers.
Yes.
But he's chosen to not do so. So sometimes there's greater politics that comes into play with regard to how the Ministerial Code is interpreted. Ultimately, the ultimate arbiter of that code is the Prime Minister himself. So it could be the case that the Prime Minister says this is not a sacking offence, but ultimately this gets to the political core of the issue. How much free rein can the Home Secretary have? If the Prime Minister is saying one thing and the Home Secretary is saying something else, does that undermine the authority of the Prime Minister? Does that make him look weaker? That's the fear of some on the Conservative benches. However, there are also Conservative MPs who think that Suella Braverman is a standard bearer for the right of the party. To lose her from the government would be to be putting up two fingers to a huge chunk of the electorate who believe in what she says and believe in the forthright way in which she says it.
Is it also pertinent to this particular case with Suella that it's not the first time she's put her foot in it, and it's not the first time this week that she's used language that's raised a few eyebrows at the very least? How much of those previous gaffes, do you think, add to a situation of this is an accumulative situation rather than an isolated incident?
We have seen some cabinet ministers being uncomfortable when questioned about the sort of language that Suella Braverman has used. Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, earlier this week was squirming when he was asked to justify the term hate marches, which Suella Braverman has brought into our political lingo, I suppose. But again, that gets to that crucial point of how much leeway is the Home Secretary being given by the Prime Minister? Is she a special case? Does she have more freedom than other Conservative cabinet ministers, perhaps because she represents a significant constituency amongst Conservative support? Is the Prime Minister going to be more worried about votes slipping away to parties like Reform UK if he sacks her? But also he needs to think about the other half of his coalition, a tightly balanced situation. Might Rishi Sunak be thinking about some of those seats in the southeast of England, in the home counties, perhaps some of these seats that voted Remain that might be leaning more Liberal Democrat now? Might he think that Suella Braverman is putting voters off in the blue wall, even if she might be attracting voters in the red wall?
You know a lot of people in Westminster. This is the talk of the town. Do you think she will survive this?
I think it's really difficult to say. One of the interesting points that is sort of bubbling along the rumour mill today is that Rishi Sunak has been thought to be thinking of doing a whole cabinet reshuffle for quite some time. We were expecting one in September, it then got delayed. We were expecting one in October, it then got delayed. We're now into November. This could be one of the last proper chances for Rishi Sunak to set a new top team going into the election that will happen probably within the next 12 months. And so this much rumoured reshuffle, could this be sort of the instigating point for a much wider reorganisation of the cabinet? That's an open question in Westminster today.
That's interesting, because normally they'd promote her sideways and get her out of the spotlight. That's what you're saying. Normally that might be somewhere like Northern Ireland, but she's been talking about Northern Ireland today and annoying people over there, comparing the Palestinian marchers to marchers in Ulster. So where do you think they might shuffle her off to?
Well, I think it's a really interesting point, because in previous governments we have seen people being offered a demotion, and then instead of taking a lower ranking job, instead of facing that sort of humiliation of moving from a great office of state to a more minor role in cabinet, we have seen in the past cabinet ministers walk away instead. And that might be a risk for Rishi Sunak. If Suella Braverman returns to the backbenches, builds up a power base, is even more freewheeling and shooting from the hip with what she's saying, appearing on television or writing in newspapers, perhaps she then represents a completely different power base for Rishi Sunak. Is she more dangerous to him on the backbenches than she is in the government? That's a real consideration for him.
And I wonder, Tom, if that's part of the 3D chess, and that is, if Boris Johnson says the Tories are drifting towards defeat, they don't stand for anything anymore, Suella certainly does stand for something. You may not agree with it, but she stands for something. If the party is wiped out, if they have to regroup, if they decide we need to be a proper conservative movement, she would fancy her chances as leading that movement, wouldn't she?
I think we have to look at all of the events in the last couple of weeks and the machinations within the top of the Tory party through that prism of leadership. There are very few Conservative MPs who genuinely believe that Rishi Sunak will win the next election. And so everything is being thought of in sort of two stages, in one step ahead. What happens after the next election, after the likely defeat of the Prime Minister? How do the Conservatives regroup, reorganise, and frankly, who is the next leader?
Superb stuff. Tom Harwood, as ever, excellent analysis. Certainly one that's getting you going out there. Please send in your thoughts.